Now it's my pleasure to introduce Lynn Batten, who is a UCLA Professor Emeritus. And as many of you know, he has been with us. He's one of our most popular speakers, and his humor and insights have made for many lively lectures and conversations. And we're so happy to have him here today. You're in for quite a treat if you haven't heard him speak before. He joined the English department at UCLA in 1969 after he earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and his master's and PhD from the University of Chicago. While his research focused on British literature from 1660 to 1798, he taught a wide spectrum of courses, from freshman composition and Jane Austen's novels to graduate courses in bibliography and literary criticism.
When you're watching your library people.
Oh, and we are going to mute everyone just so we can hear Lynn.
I'm going to mute everybody, and Susie and Lynn, please unmute yourselves.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. About 15 or so years ago, Lynn appeared on 2 programs on A&E's Mysteries of the Bible series. He made his film debut in the Z channel, Magnificent Obsession. He is the author of Pleasurable Instruction, Form and Convention in 18th Century Travel Literature, and editor of Pamela's Censure, the first published attack on Samuel Richardson. He is also the author of a number of, in his words, totally forgettable articles about culture and literature. He is addicted to travel, and I'm sure this has been a very difficult time for him not to be able to travel, but we're very thrilled to welcome him today. And we will have just a quick couple of little comments. As again, everybody's muted, but later you'll be able to enter questions in the chat box, raise your hand, and we will track and see who has questions. We'll ask, give you a chance to speak later. And just everybody know, it's like mute, and to turn on your video or off your videos in the bottom left corner, and the chat is in the middle of the screen at the bottom. So without further ado, I am happy to turn it over to Lynn. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Susie. A quite kind introduction. Thank you for having me. I hope my love for you and the group is obvious. First, I'd like to say a couple of words about my strategy today. I hope to begin with some general and relatively brief prepared words. Usually I don't have prepared words at all for our book group, but the venue seemed to call for that. And these are, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Jane Austen's Juvenalia. What I say will include thoughts about why we read the Juvenalia and why the Juvenalia are important to our understanding and appreciation of Jane Austen and her novels. To do this, I will focus on 5 works in the Juvenalia. And I know that's very limiting, but in some ways, the Juvenalia as a group is just very difficult to hold on to. The 5 works that I've chosen to focus on are Frederick and Alfreda, that's the first, Jack and Alice, the second, Love and Friendship, the third, Leslie Castle, the fourth, and finally, The History of England. After that, I hope to combat your current sense of pandemic isolation by addressing your questions, comments, and concerns. Please feel free to disagree with me. I love to arm wrestle. I often think I learn more from my students than they learn from me. Also, please forgive me if I'm not a master of either Zoom technology or Zoom etiquette. Zoom has many warts, but it is so much better than our not being able to get together at all. So, here's my introductory question. Why are we reading Jane Austen's Juvenalia? I'm certain there are several and maybe many answers to that question. One reason, of course, is that the Juvenalia are the subject of this year's AGM, which alas is not happening in Cleveland, thanks to COVID-19. But I would like to focus more on a more general reason, I'd like to claim that you and I are reading the Juvenalia because we're greedy, we're disappointed, we want more. We want more than Jane Austen's 6 completed novels. But we know there's no 7th complete novel out there, though I keep hoping to find one in my great aunt Ida's attic. Simply put, Jane Austen's early death was unfair. It was unfair to her, and it certainly was unfair to us. In some ways, this desire to read other stuff, like the Juvenalia, actually started with Jane Austen's nephew, James Edward Austen Lee. In 1869, he published a memoir of Jane Austen. I think the memoir helped make Jane Austen famous by reinterpreting her as a Victorian, which, if not honest, was exactly what she needed to appeal to a Victorian audience. Here's a passing thought. Had it not been for Austen Lee's memoir, would the Victorians have appreciated Jane Austen? And without that appreciation, would we be reading her today? And consequently, would someone else's face currently appear on the 10-pound note? I just don't know, but I speculate. Sorry, I need a page turner. By the way, I have major complaints about the reliability of Austen Lee's memoir. I think he was embarrassed that he didn't know much about his famous aunt, so he made things up about her life by reading her novels. Contemporary scholars now sometimes interpret Jane Austen's novels by citing biographical information they've gleaned from Austen Lee, who often arrived at that information merely by reading her novels. Please notice the beautiful circularity there, but please also notice that I will use one of Austen Lee's interpretations of his aunt at the very end of these remarks. When Austen Lee published a second edition of his memoir in 1871, he in effect used the famous TV commercial line. But wait, there's more. And to his original memoir, he appended Lady Susan, the Watsons, the canceled chapter from Persuasion, and some of Sanditon. Austen Lee whetted our appetites. He got us further hooked. Yes, there actually was more stuff out there. And aside from her letters, perhaps the most interesting stuff was the Juvenalia. The Juvenalia consists of 27 items, bewildering at times in their variety, transcribed by Jane Austen in 1793 into 3 notebooks called Volume the First, probably begun in 1787 after she left the Abbey School. Then the second volume, the second, probably begun in 1790, and volume the third, probably begun in 1792. Collected in that fashion, her writings replicate the so-called triple-decker 3-volume presentation of traditional novels of her day, novels like Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. Northanger Abbey and Persuasion are simply double-deckers. Is this 3-volume manuscript collection further proof of Jane Austen's artistic playfulness? I actually think so. After Jane Austen's death, These 3 volumes were distributed among 3 different family members. One is now in the Bodleian volume, not family member. 2 are in the British Museum, but all can now sit on the shelves of our own personal libraries, thankfully. Here are 3 general observations I'd like to make about the Juvenalia. First, I'm convinced that Jane Austen intended most of them to be read aloud to and/or by her family members. Her stories were entertainments, much the same way that playing the spinet or family theatricals were performance art. Her family was actually lucky to have no radio, TV, internet, cell phone, Netflix. Second, Jane Austen's family read many books for pleasure and instruction. In a letter to her sister Cassandra, dated December 19th, 1798, Jane Austen famously described her family as being great novel readers and not ashamed of being so. As a consequence, I feel certain Jane Austen's family caught allusions in her Juvenalia to novels and to other books that they were reading at the time. Third, I'm convinced that most of Jane Austen's Juvenalia are meant to be satiric, at times wickedly satiric, about those books her family was reading and about other things. As such, they were meant to be great fun. Someone I see on the nightly news might well have called Jane Austen a nasty woman. I think she would have loved it if he had done that. Here's the definition of satire that I used to make my UCLA students memorize. Quote, satire is an attack by means of a fiction on a recognizable victim that exists outside the literary work. Please notice there are 3 components, 3 necessary components in that definition. For a satire to exist, there one has got to be an attack. I used to like to joke with my students, find a kid in the class, look at him in the eye and say, "You're stupid." And then ask the class, does that mean that was a satire? A little bit of a joke there, but obviously that's not satire because there's no fiction. We must have a victim, we must have some fiction, and that victim must be recognizable. So here's, and by the way, Jane Austen, I think, is really an 18th century author. She is more akin to Samuel Johnson. She is more akin to Alexander Pope than she is to romantic authors who come after her. The victim of a satire may be a person, it may be a group of people, it may be a particular literary work, it may be a group of kinds of literary work. I'm certain Jane Austen's family recognized particular victims, friends, acquaintances, literary works, literary conventions that we in the 21st century totally miss. There's a special word for satires that attack literary works, literary conventions. We call them parodies. And I think much of the Juvenalia are parodic in what they do. As a general rule, parodies must be always shorter, considerably shorter than the works they satirize. Also, they should be fun. They should make the silliness of their satiric victims look even more silly. That finally brings us to works like Frederick and Alfreda, Jack and Alice. Those two works are probably the earliest of Jane Austen's writings that survive. They show us what the astonishingly precocious Jane Austen could achieve at 12 years of age. Pretty astonishing. I wish I could have done that at 12. Frederick and Alfreda and Jack and Alice are primarily parodies. They satirize the novels of sensibility that flooded the market in Jane Austen's childhood and that incidentally influenced poor Marianne Dashwood. Here are some of the characteristics Frederick and Alfreda and Jack and Alice share with novels of sensibility. They explain the obvious. Quote, Mr. Johnson was once upon a time 53. In a 12-month afterwards, he was 54. Duh. They contain gratuitous references to the classics. Quote, the purling stream brought up from the Vale of Tempe. They employ contradictory descriptions. One of my favorites is, you are charming fair, notwithstanding your forbidding squint, your greasy tresses, and your swollen back. Actually, it sounds like a compliment I used to get from my mother-in-law. They develop impossibly complex plots. I must confess to you that I tried to chart the plots in both of these works and ultimately threw up my hands and said, it's not worth the effort. But most important, they glorify passion over reason. Look at the final description of Alfreda. After Frederick refuses to marry her, quote, she accordingly fainted and was in such a hurry to have a succession of fainting fits that she had scarcely patience enough to recover from one before she fell into another. And that actually works. Frederick, who usually was as bold as brass, succumbs to her fainting spells and marries her. Ta-da. In serious literature, silly tends to be bad, unintentional. In parody, silly is always good because it's intentional. In serious literature, we live in London and Bath. In parody, we live in Crankham-Dunbarry and Pammy Diddle. So there's my first set of books in the Juvenalia. Second set of books in the Juvenalia are Love and Friendship and Leslie Castle that I want to look at. They show Austen's initial forays into the epistolary novel form. That's the genre she used in Lady Susan, and that's the genre she apparently first used and then gave up on when writing Sense and Sensibility. But more important, Love and Friendship seems to look back at Jane Austen's earlier parodies of novels of sensibility. Indeed, it's a longer, more developed version of what she does in Frederick and Alfreda and Jack and Alice. And yes, nobody seems to have told Jane Austen that it's I before E except after C, or when sounding like A, as in neighbor. Maybe we can have a t-shirt that says that for her. I'm totally forgiving, however. and I hope you are also. By contrast to Love and Friendship, Leslie Castle seems to look forward to Jane Austen's more mature novels. It tries to be a real novel. In moving from Love and Friendship to Leslie Castle, something significant, I think, has just happened in Jane Austen's art. And we're able to watch that as we read her Juvenalia. She isn't there yet, but she's certainly getting there. In Leslie Castle, Charlotte Luttrell is a wonderfully comic character, but she's not a satiric character. She's based neither on a character in a satirized novel, nor on a literary trope. There's always the chance she's based on someone in Jane Austen's neighborhood, but we have no way of knowing that. Charlotte, you will remember, is comically more concerned that the food she has cooked for her sister's wedding will be wasted than that her future brother-in-law, thrown from his horse, has just died. Like Lady Susan, Leslie Castle remains incomplete. Some have hypothesized that Jane Austen, poised to send her characters on a grand tour of Europe, had to give up the narrative because she had no personal knowledge of European travel. Maybe, I just don't know about that. By the way, long ago, I calculated that in her entire life, Jane Austen never traveled farther from home than the distance between here and Bakersfield. But then she didn't have to travel that far to learn what she learned. Finally, there's the history of England in the Juvenalia. It's a parody, but a parody not of novels, but of history books. Actually, I think it's a parody of the prejudices that afflict authors of histories. A case has been made that Jane Austen makes fun specifically of Oliver Goldsmith's History of England, or more to the point, she makes fun of his Whiggish interpretation of English history. The narrator at the end of the History of England says, quote, "I am myself partial to the Roman Catholic religion." What? Jane Austen is the daughter of a clergyman in the Church of England. Some have taken this statement of Jane Austen's actual belief. I take it as a parody of Goldsmith's extreme Whiggism by trading it for an equally extreme Toryism. Do remember, Austen Leigh said his aunt was a moderate, not an extreme Tory. And there I go, quoting Austen Leigh, even though I just warned you not to trust him. Maybe he could be correct some of the time. One final observation about satire in the History of England. It contains bizarre cameo drawings made by Cassandra. If you haven't seen them, I would encourage you to look at them online, since they nicely complement the satiric force of the book. Most scholars have suggested that Cassandra pictures the monarchs of England as being members and acquaintances of the Austen family. Beloved Mary Queen of Scots looks a lot like Jane Austen. Hated Queen Elizabeth looks a lot like a scary version of Mrs. Austen. I bet Mrs. Austen actually heard the History of England read, but somehow I bet she never got to see the illustrations. Those are my opening words. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And if you don't mind, Katie and others, I'd like to hear from you and your observations.
Okay, anybody have their hand raised? I don't see any hands yet.
I'll start. I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you think that some of these that she was writing and that she would read them to her family by the fireplace, and then that kind of gave her an idea of how to then write stories that were more relatable later, because she had started with these and maybe her family gave her some insight or some feedback to them?
You know, I think that works two ways. I have taught, I've never taught creative writing, but I've taught expository writing. And it's fascinating to me. I occasionally would tell my students, bring your essay to class, bring 2 copies of your essay to class. Take one of those copies and read it aloud. And then based on what you heard when you read it aloud, revise what you were planning on giving to me. And I think it was a very useful exercise. Indeed, it's an exercise that I'd suggest to folks in this group if you are doing any writing, or indeed if you're writing letters or actually doing anything on the internet. It's amazing if you hear what you have read. So I think there are 2 pluses in Jane Austen's reading her writing to her family. One is, I'm sure they gave her advice and they responded that way. But also I'm arguing that the mere act of reading something helps you see things that you don't see otherwise. Indeed, I mean, I think Jane Austen really is, and I'm talking about her published novels here, I think Jane Austen is meant to be read aloud. This was the entertainment. This was the entertainment that folks had. And I think when we read it silently, we tend to miss a good deal of the joy of experiencing Jane Austen. I used to joke, I used to get my students laugh at me when I would say, one of the most pleasurable things that ever happens in my life is I would take all of my clothes off and get in bed and roll over and have my wife read a novel to me. And of course, I knew what I was doing there, but there is that pleasure of both being read to and the pleasure of reading to other people. So I don't know if that quite addresses your question, Katie, but I think there's a performative dimension to Jane Austen's art.
Jeannie Talbot had a related question. Jeannie?
Yes.
You want to ask that?
Oh, sure. Sure, yeah. Hi, thank you so much. Very, very interesting introduction and sort of description of some of the works. We recently did some readings out loud of the Juvenalia in our San Diego region, and people were, they were on Zoom, but I've been told everyone was like rolling with laughter in the aisles. And interestingly enough, about 7 years ago or so, we tried to discuss the Juvenalia in like a book discussion format, and it was kind of like a lead weight.
Yeah, where do you go? Yeah,
read the Juvenalia and discuss. Unless you really break it down the way you do, it's a little difficult. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. Why they just come alive and jump off the page when you're reading them aloud, when you're sort of uncontrollable laughter, even by the narrator, maybe acting out the characters a little bit. What is it about the Juvenalia?
Well, the easy answer is Jane Austen's brilliant. There's no getting around that. But I do think the dimension of performing, especially the Juvenalia, makes perfect sense when we remember that she and her family would read this aloud to each other with that performance dimension behind it. And she's silly, and she loves being silly. These are, you know, I think this may seem demeaning to Jane Austen, but in part, I think her Juvenalia are written to evoke laughter from the audience. And the more laughter she gets when she reads it to her family and or friends, the more feedback that she's got, the happier she is. So, but again, in part, these are so entertaining because they're comic, and they're comic because they are largely satiric, and we like pretentious art to get taken down a notch or two. Unfortunately, we like pretentious professors to get taken down a notch or two also, but I won't go in that direction. But no, I mean, I just, these are so funny. And this runs throughout almost all of the Juvenalia. I'll be honest and say there's some bits and pieces of the Juvenalia that I don't know quite what to make of. But even if I don't understand it, I probably find it possible to laugh at it. Other observations or questions?
Yes, we have a question from Heidi Green.
Yes.
Heidi, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, Heidi? Heidi, I see. Oh, there you go.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. My question was, there seems to me a big literary gap between Lady Susan and the rest of Juvenalia. I've always wondered if there's a bunch of the Juvenalia stories that are missing that would help explain that gap or that leap in writing maturity that seems to happen in Lady Susan. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first off, I mean, when Jane Austen wrote her Juvenalia, to the best of my knowledge, she wrote her Juvenalia on bits of paper. And what we call the Juvenalia now is something that she put together in the 3 volumes I described. I suspect, I cannot prove this, but I suspect she wrote other things that never found their way into her collected Juvenalia. But what I tried to suggest in what I just said was, I think when we look at Leslie Castle, we really see the beginnings of a Lady Susan. I mean, they are both epistolary novels, and they're both satiric. So the genealogy of Lady Susan strikes me as coming directly after the development that we see going on in the Juvenalia. And then, of course, and what Jane Austen does is she writes a portion of Lady Susan. I'm tempted to believe that she was scared people were too much in love with Lady Susan to keep going on. I mean, and in love with her, not, I mean, she's an evil person, but guys, keep in mind, evil is interesting often. I'm thinking of some examples nowadays that I will not mention directly, in which I think evil is not interesting. But you know, this is one of the reasons we like to say, I don't want to go to heaven. There's all the boring people up there. I want to go to hell, where all of the interesting people are and the interesting actions are going on down there. So I don't know, but I mean, there is that sense of maybe Lady Susan is a bit too seductive in her rakishness. I mean, she clearly reappears in the form of someone like in Mansfield Park with Mary, but I don't know. Did that come close to addressing your question?
Yes, it just seems like there's such a big gap
Yeah.
between the Juvenalia and Lady Susan. I was just looking for ways to explain it, but I'll
Yep.
re-look at Leslie Castle. Thank you.
And the other thing is, I mean, there are other gaps in Jane Austen's writing. I mean, virtually everyone who reads her novels recognizes that something happens between the production of the first three novels, and I would call them Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. And then something happens, and there's a really different tone going on in Mansfield Park, in Emma, and in Persuasion. And again, I think, there probably would have been a pretty interesting leap between Persuasion and Sanditon. One of my many complaints about life is that Jane Austen didn't live long enough to show us what that leap was going to be. And the movie doesn't do it, guys.
Jeannie
Thank
Talbot
you.
had another question. I'm sorry. Thanks, Heidi. Jeannie?
Oh, yeah, this is, I think I might have missed a little bit of this, Lynn. You had talked about love and friendship and Leslie Castle looking back to earlier works. I wasn't sure what you meant by that. Could you explain a little bit more?
Thank you for asking that. What I meant to say is that in some ways, love and friendship seems longer, but more of the same kind of literary parody that we saw going on in Jane Austen's earlier works. By contrast, I think that Leslie Castle seems more like Jane Austen's subsequent works, where Leslie Castle is moving away from satire and parody and really seems to be a first draft at a real serious epistolary novel. So that's why I think there's a gap that we see, a gap in education, Jane Austen's education of herself, between her earlier writings and her later ones. And I'd like to place Leslie Castle there as pointing us in the direction of a serious novelist. I mean, Leslie Castle could have become a serious novel. She just didn't finish it. And as I said, and I'm not certain I believe the people who claim that she had to give up on it because she was sending her characters to Europe, and she'd never been to Europe, so she didn't know what to say. I think Jane Austen is smart enough to handle that, but I think she knows that she's better off describing what's going on in her backyard than describing what's going on in faraway places. So I'm excited about Leslie Castle. I think I see the germs of the really great novels that come later. But again, she's a kid. I have recently thrown out the first two novels that I wrote. One was in first grade, and the other was in second grade. And before you think this is an indication of how bright I was, I wrote them because my teacher made me write them. And we had to bind them. So there was cloth that we put over top, and we had to illustrate them. And I looked at them and I thought, these are so embarrassing. I don't want my grandchildren to see them. So they went out in the trash. Fortunately, Jane Austen had good sense not to do that with her Juvenalia. And of course, that they came from when I was 6 and 7 rather than 12 and following, though I don't know that I could have done that much better at 12. Other observations?
Katie has a question.
Yes.
Well, when I was reading Leslie Castle, I felt like you said, that it was much more like an early novel. I felt more like I was reading Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility. She does a lot more of it, giving us some background and telling us about the people and the places. But when I read Love and Friendship, all I could hear was Miss Bates, right? Every letter just seemed like somebody was talking like Miss Bates. And I just wanted to get your take on that and if you agree or not.
Oh, I agree. But I think there is a lack of focus in Love and Friendship. I mean, I hear her, but there are other things that don't seem to fit in with the Miss Bates formula that we have. So no, I agree. I mean, I do see seeds among the Juvenalia of lots of things that Jane Austen ultimately is able to refine in her novels. But no, I think that's a great observation. I buy it. Others?
Jeannie has another question.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to dominate, but I've been doing a lot of studying myself on the Juvenalia, and you seem very knowledgeable, so good person to ask these things. Can you explain a little bit about the epistolary form and why that was popular at a particular time, and why an author might choose to write in that format? What are the advantages, and is it easier or more fun for the author? You know, just anything that comes to mind.
It's a great question. And let me say this. In the 18th century, I mean, look, the novel is a new form. I mean, there are people who want, for example, to call Don Quixote a novel. It's not. It's a satire. It's not a real novel. I happen to be a strict constructionist, and I believe that in England, the novel was invented in 1740. I think the first real novel actually was Pamela. Now, by novel, what I mean here is a realistic story. There have been things like novels before, but they largely are what we would nowadays classify as romances. My definition of a romance here is it has nothing to do with love and kisses and candy and the like. A romance is a narrative that builds into it some degree of unbelievability. The characters are not real in romances. They do not reflect the real lives of the contemporary readers of the novels. So my definition of a novel is a novel reflects the real life existence of the contemporary readers of that novel. And I think the first novel really is Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews. In some ways, it's Pamela. These are all from the early 1740s. Remember, the word novel itself means something new. But when the novel was invented in England in the 1740s, there actually seemed to have been two kinds of novels. One kind of novel, which is like what we've come to expect the novel, is what we call a historical novel. It begins here, it ends here, it's got a narrative thread, and we have a narrator that we can identify with. Almost at the same time, we had novels that were written in the form of letters. And I think they're great. I mean, in part, I think we have novels written in the form of letters in the 18th century because the 18th century was the letter writing century. Everyone wrote letters. Everyone saved letters. So as a reader of a novel, I could easily identify with the collection of letters that appeared in an epistolary novel. I actually think that epistolary novels, to some extent, tend to be more artistically sophisticated than what we think of as the more traditional novel form. They're great in terms of handling ambiguities. I love, for example, in Lady Susan, we are seduced into believing Lady Susan is telling us the truth until we discover by reading someone else she wasn't telling us the truth at all. I have a friend who likes the metaphor I'm about to share with you. In the 18th century, in the 1740s and 50s and 60s, we essentially have two kinds of novels, what we call the traditional novel and the epistolary novel. In the 1980s, we have two kinds of videotapes, VHS and beta. My techie friends tell me that we wound up killing beta, even though it was the better of the two. And between you and me, I think we have largely killed the epistolary novel over the fact that it is also the better of the two. There's still occasionally an epistolary novel, and some of you maybe have read a couple of novels that are now written in the form of emails, but this is not something that we are any longer doing seriously. There are problems with the epistolary novel form, and I think Jane Austen occasionally acknowledge or lets us see that. One of the problems in epistolary novel is, how do you describe someone is good when you're describing yourself? And maybe there are a couple of spots in our readings for today where we have the writer of the letter having to tell us something good about herself in order to progress in the novel, when it makes her sound like a totally prideful person. So everything in epistolary novel must be filtered through a consciousness. And bottom line is, I think epistolary novels are harder to read. They are more demanding on the reader than more traditional novels are, because you've got to make connections. I think that's part of their sophistication, but you can see how some readers who are not terribly sophisticated readers would be put off by them. Does that sort of help?
Yeah, thank you. That was great. That's the most I've ever heard about epistolary novels.
Well,
I've been wondering that my whole life.
Yeah, I mean, I love them. I love them. They can be annoying also. I never had the courage to make my students read Pamela, which is endless. And Pamela has to describe how good she is, because it starts off in an epistolary form, but then she's essentially imprisoned by her master, and it turns into a journal. But it's one thing for me to say, I'm handsome, and it's a lot more believable if someone else says you're handsome. But that's one of our problems here. But I love them, and I wish we had a return to, every so often a modern novelist will try an epistolary novel, but I don't think it ever really quite works. Other observations?
Susan Burke had a really interesting observation about multitasking in the Regency era. Susan?
Oh, thank you. I do think in Jane Austen's family, the primary reason for reading aloud was entertainment. However, I suspect in general, her age maybe was a time with more reading aloud, perhaps as I keep thinking of women with all these tasks they had to do, darning socks or embroidery or whatever, knitting, peeling potatoes. I can't picture Mrs. Austen quite doing that during these sessions, but it just helped to have one reader with the best lighting, maybe, and reading so that people could engage in other tasks at the same time. I mean, I walked crossword puzzles in front of the television set during NCIS, but there's nobody reading in the room aloud. And I think maybe it was just more the custom of the country and the times then.
Oh, I think so. And I mean, I can see obviously things like sewing and knitting going on while someone is reading, but I can even see the more mundane actions like shelling peas. If you've got one person can entertain a relatively large number of people. I mean, nowadays for us, if I get my wife to read to me, I really can't be doing something else. But in those days, I think your observation about multitasking is really important in terms of understanding the role of reading. And as a corollary to this, I do think I have a book group that has, thanks to the pandemic, has decided that we're finally going to read War and Peace. It's taking us a while, and we're doing it in bits and pieces. But in our lives, a 1,400, 1,500 page novel is almost impossible. I'd argue, and I see this in book groups, if the book is over 350 pages, we don't want to read it. I think the exact opposite was going on in the 18th century. I mean, I think the 18th century, if they got a 1,000-page book, their response would be, oh goody, I don't have to go get another book for X number of nights of reading. This is like having extra wine in the cellar. I don't have to go out again. I like that long book. But I think we've got, as a consequence, almost 180-degree opposite response to lengthy books than folks had in the 18th century. I have trouble getting students to read Tom Jones, which I think is one of the world's greatest all-time ever books, but it's just too long for them. But it wouldn't be too long for people in the 18th century. Wouldn't be too long for Jane Austen. Other observations?
Jerry Walker has a question. Jerry?
Trying to take myself off of mute. I thought that there were elements of comedy that sort of appeared at the early days of cinematic art, when Edward and Laura and Philip and Augusta tear out of Sir Edward's house in Love and Friendship and hop into his carriage and dash away.
Yes.
And then a few pages later, after Edward and Augustus are off at the prison, Laura and the other lady are dashing along in the carriage, and Laura lowers the window, the front glasses, and inquired of every decent-looking person that we passed if they had seen my Edward. But as we drove too rapidly to allow them to answer my repeated inquiries, I gained little or indeed no information concerning him. So I just thought these were the sorts of things of slapstick that they would put in early movies.
I couldn't agree more. And again, I think that's one of the real appeals in the book. I mean, you can say it's cheesy, and in some ways, in some ways, Laurel and Hardy are cheesy. I've been watching Buster Keaton movies with my grandson, who is learning to read. And by the way, Buster Keaton silent films are wonderful because they hold the words on the screen for so long. I mean, you wonder what the reading skills of people were like when they first hit the theaters. So I'm into Buster Keaton's pratfalls and silliness, and I got to say I see some of it in what I read for today with Jane Austen. I think that's a great observation.
Thank you.
Sharon has a question next.
Yes, Sharon.
Sharon, are you still with us?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great. So I guess I was wondering, with writing in the form of letters seems to me to be easier than writing in another format, because you don't have to worry about what person in which you're going to write, and you don't have to worry about how to create dialogue and quotes and intermixing with description, which can get somewhat complicated. But if you can just think of a letter from one person to the other, you kind of get around all that.
You do, but you've got to consider, I mean, we love to believe that the letters we receive are honest. I think most of our authors in the 18th century who used the epistolary form recognized that there were at least two kinds of dishonesty that occurred in letters. One was out and out lying. But the other was out and out ignorance, inability to understand what's really going on around. I mean, there are many letters and epistolary novels that are written by folks who the author wants us to believe, think they're telling us the truth, but then they give us enough clues, either thanks to inconsistencies within that author's own letters or inconsistencies between that author's letters and other authors' letters, to recognize that something strange, something screwy is going on here. I mean, there have been moments in which I have wished that contemporary American society was more into reading epistolary novels, when I hear some of our politicians talking and probably in some ways actually believing what they're saying, which strikes me as being beyond belief. Maybe we should be trained better at detecting those kinds of things. And I think the epistolary novel aims at doing it. So my argument is, I do think that epistolary novels in some ways are much harder to write because they're limiting. You got to become one or more people in order to write them. But then you've got to deal with the interpersonal relationships that lead people either to be deluded because they're stupid, or to say things that are just simply not true in order to cover the truth. So I'm a real fan of the epistolary novel.
Me too.
We have a few more. Elizabeth Pickens. Elizabeth?
Oh, I just had made some comments. I didn't really have a question. let's see. I said that the epistolary novel lended realism because it looks like real letters. So, and then also that in an epistolary novel, you could just to describe how good someone is or how handsome they are, you could describe how someone else reacted to you, and that could indicate that sort of. That's
Well, I think those are both true observations about the epistolary novel. The real problem comes if we've got a person writing a letter who starts talking about how good he or she is, or if the author somehow has got to get that information across and only has access to that person's voice. And I'm not going to try to find it in my book, but in my rereading of the Juvenalia this time, I several times wrote in the margins, whoa, this is the problem of saying nice things about yourself because the author believes they have to be said in order for the reader to understand what's going on. And those that can be in some cases remedied. I mean, I actually was wondering if Jane Austen was aware, and I think Jane Austen's aware of most things, if she was aware of the fact that her statements could be seen as focusing on the limitations of the epistolary novel form. Other observations?
Vicky too had a comment. We have a few more questions coming up too. Vicky, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. It was, I just wanted to share with you in connection with this discussion about the epistolary novel. I just actually read the Book of Ages, The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's sister, about whom we don't hear very much. But it's by Jill Lepore, who's the historian at Harvard who writes for the New Yorker. And at the end, she compares Jane Franklin with Jane Austen and talks about how that Austen's novels are actually an answer to histories in a sense. And she particularly makes the point that the early epistolary novels like Pamela and then also Robinson Crusoe, which was supposed to be a journal, and Tom Jones, they called themselves histories. They insisted that they were histories, that they were real. And so the epistolary novel was created as they felt like they had to justify their existence by calling them real histories. And in a sense, like Jane Austen freed herself from that because she could write fiction, and it did not have to disguise itself as real letters or real journals, but rather honest narrations about real lives. And it's just funny also to have her making fun of history in History of England, and then going on to write these novels, which are, in their own way, more truthful than many histories. So I'm fascinated by this conversation about the epistolary form and how it evolved and why. So.
I think that's a really smart observation. And I think there are a number of cultural things going on here. People like Defoe grew up in a religious environment that looked upon any fiction as being highly suspect. I can remember I graduated from high school in 1961, and I can remember going to high school with a kid whose parents would not let him go to any movie unless it was a documentary, because fiction is evil and fact is good. Now, granted, I grew up in the South, so that maybe is not as widespread as it might be. But I think Defoe, who grew up in a similar kind of religious background, casts his fictions in the form of histories to get around the complaint that fiction is evil because it's lies. And he does it all the time, and he pretends to all kinds of factuality that simply doesn't exist there. We see it in things like Robinson Crusoe, for example. And in most of his first person narratives, we know Defoe is writing them largely out of whole cloth, but he's pretending he's telling someone else's words.
And no, I think the evilness of the novel is Abbey.
I'm losing you.
The novel is somehow suspect. In Northanger Abbey, the evilness of the novel is a constant theme that comes up again and again. So.
Yep, absolutely. Or let's put it this way. I would say it's the seductiveness. Personally, I don't think Jane Austen is against Gothic romances. But many people were. I think she is against people misreading Gothic romances. And Catherine Morland's problem is she has read them and interpreted them as models for real life, when in fact they're simply artistic constructs to enable us to get out of the situations of real life. But no, I think this is really important. I mean, among other things, you could look at something like Pilgrim's Progress, and I think most people forget the fact that Pilgrim's Progress is presented as a real account of a dream, a vision that someone has. And this is a way of getting around the fact, well, all these things didn't really happen, but they really were dreamt by someone. And that's my way of making the book factual. The games we play with each other in order to support our preconceived ideas about what is virtue, what is vice, what is fiction, and what is nonfiction.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great observation.
Our next question is from Nicolene. Can you unmute? Unmute yourself first.
There we go. All right. Well, my impression was when she's writing, and that would be true of a teenager, you know, how they will entertain any idea that comes down the pipe. And she seemed very anarchist to me. She was like an anarchist. And in her ideas of, you know, the characters that she was portraying, then before she was, you know, she had to settle down and write serious novels that kind of had a little bit moral to them. One thing that makes me wonder about is that she's in this, you know, obviously very brilliant family, but her father is religious, and yet they entertain, you know, her Juvenalia is like way out there. And no one apparently was offended, you know, nothing got thrown out later. That's kind of what surprised me. Do you see that that high-spiritedness in her novels that you see in Juvenalia?
You know, I think so. I mean, I think her novels are a natural outgrowth of what we see in her Juvenalia, as long as we remember she's a kid.
Yeah.
And she's doing, in some ways, the equivalent of reading and writing her own comic strips here. She's basing what she's writing really on two things. the people around her, and the literary models that she and her family are reading. The quotation that I gave you, I think, is really telling. It says, "We were a family of novel readers and not ashamed of it." And I think that's just loaded with implications. I mean, one of them is there were many people who were ashamed of being novel readers. Novel reading was seen as an inferior undertaking. You should be reading, again, going back to the previous question, you should be reading nonfiction. Of course, my argument with Jane Austen's History of England is she's suggesting that this fiction, that the so-called nonfiction of the history of England is itself a fiction, which I think leads to some of Jane Austen's sophistications here.
Well, Plato says that poetry is closer to the truth than history. Well, I would say Jane Austen's writing is closer to the truth.
I could not agree more. I mean, I think the best way of capturing the truth is through well-made fiction. Yeah. But most of the world is not as enlightened as you and I are. So, and I don't know what to do about that. No, but I agree 100%.
Next up, Cara King.
Yeah, thanks. Lynn, when you were talking about the farcical nature of some of the comedy and it relating to the early, similar to the early silent movies, it occurred to me to wonder, was that a similar style of comedy to what they had in comic plays of the period? And could they have influenced her style right there?
Gosh, I wish I were smart enough to answer that. I just don't know. And while I have taught both British and American plays, the fascinating thing to me is that the landscape of plays, and by the way, we know that one of the things going on in the Austen household is, as I briefly alluded to, they do amateur theatrics, which I think puts a very important twist on our reading of Mansfield Park and Lover's Vows as being the play there. But I got to confess to you that I know very little about the plays that were going on that Jane Austen would have been reading. And I don't know much about the plays that were going on in the background of the early years of film in the United States. So I got to plead embarrassed ignorance here.
Well, thank you.
Linda Feynman has a question.
Hi, it's actually a comment about the epistolary form. I'm not sure, just because I'm not used to the style anymore, that I would be doing that well reading a whole novel that way, but I recently read a really effective short story done. The author was Nafissa Thompson Spires. She wrote a collection of short stories called Heads of the Colored People. In one of the short stories, two mothers are exchanging snide remarks via notes that they put in their little girls' backpacks. And it's just hilarious because you have the case of basically two unreliable narrators.
Mm-hmm.
The girls are feuding at school and these mothers are defending their respective daughters, and it just escalates, and it's just hilarious. But it's like you say, you can't really say I'm handsome or I'm beautiful, talk about yourself. Really can't do that with your child either, but both of these mothers are attempting to outdo each other with how wonderful their children are. So it can work very well as a short story form.
I'm sorry, would you give me her name again?
Yes, it's Nafissa Thompson Spires, and her collection of short stories is called Heads of the Colored People.
Perfect.
Okay, next up is Annie Combsbrook. Annie?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this. It's just wonderful. It's so much fun. I was just actually observing, you had used the word precocious for her, which I think describes exactly the earliest stuff. And I was just basically wondering where that, she had obviously developed a very sophisticated sense of character observation to be able to lampoon these characters so well. And my question was, where would that come from in her limited travels? But I think you answered that by her reading.
Well, I think that, and I would add to it, she seems to look long, hard, and deeply at the people around her. I mean, I suspect many of us just don't see what's going on around us. I mean, here we've got the small village, the limited number of characters, and she seems to understand them much better than the people in her environs understand themselves. I'm sorry, this may sound like a digression, but I am the au pair in my family now. I have a 4-year-old granddaughter who is about to enter TK and a 7-year-old grandson who is about to enter 2nd grade. And I am increasingly interested in how they're learning and what they're learning and to what extent it works. I mean, we all know that Jane Austen went off to school and then was brought back. So she was essentially homeschooled, a concept that I used to be not terribly in favor of. Of course, everyone is homeschooled now because of the coronavirus, and I may change my attitudes. But there may be a virtue in simply, letting the kid learn on his or her own, or letting the really bright kid learn on his or her very own. But I mean, the Reverend Mr. Austen was their teacher. Mother was their teacher also. And somehow they learned the really important things that they needed to know, aside from I before E, except after C, except, okay.
I love the construct that she uses, say with Lizzie and Anne in Persuasion, of this pillar of sanity and sense that then everything else is a juxtaposition of this overblown personality that all makes sense. But
yep.
It's a beautiful thing.
And I would add also, I mean, there are many recurring themes in Jane Austen's novels. I think one of the most important is the theme of education. And one of my arguments is that one of Jane Austen's goals in her novels is to educate us in terms of understanding the people that populate our lives. I mean, I can remember many years ago having to deal with a colleague who struck me as being identical to Mr. Palmer. And Jane Austen helped me. I think I knew something about this guy in 1985, largely as a result of having read Jane Austen and seen the idiocy of a Mr. Palmer.
Good deal. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I don't know, iPad 39, I'm not sure who that is.
Jan.
Hi.
Jan Fahey.
Hi.
Hi, Jan.
Hi. Jane Austen's novels are all full of letters, writing letters, reading letters, and how they reveal character and change plot lines and all of that. But I can't remember that many instances where we actually get to see the contents of a letter in her published novels, except maybe I was thinking of Mary Musgrove's letters to Anne, where she writes about what's been going on at Uppercross And I think it's interesting that she came back to that form where we actually get to see the content of a letter and how revealing it is of Mary's character.
Yes. And of course, one of the points here is that Mary, who is the mother, is deficient in mothering the way in which Elizabeth would be the better mother there. I mean, I gotta say, and I hope this doesn't sound like I am revealing a lack of my own masculinity, but when at the end of when in Persuasion, I read that letter at the end of Persuasion, I think that's got to be one of the very best letters I've ever read in a literary work, where here Wentworth has been overhearing the conversation and now declares himself and his intentions. And while there are not that many letters, and while I do believe that Jane Austen initially thought of novels in terms of letters, I think the letters that she did continue in her novels were incredibly powerful and came at astonishingly important moments in the plot.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So Liz had a question about whether it was preferred to have a variety of correspondence in an epistolary novel or to have a single back and forth conversation. Was there one considered a pure form of epistolary novel?
You know, I don't know. I mean, in what happens in both Pamela and Clarissa is because they are both confined, there are not multiple recipients to the letters. I mean, you probably, your knowledge of 18th century, 19th century titles helped you a bit when you got to Leslie Castle, because we need to remember that Miss X is the elder daughter and Miss something X is always a younger daughter in this. So, I mean, my real answer is I really don't know. But, you know, the epistolary form is challenging, but handled well, I think it is well worth the payoff of the effort that goes into it. And I'm not certain that sentence made any sense, but forgive me.
Oh, we appreciate that, Lynn. Carolyn, you're up.
Oh, I was just going to say that I heard that reading fiction gives you empathy for others. And so that's certainly a good reason to read fiction. You can get more into people's motives.
I cannot prove it, but it seems, what you said seems certainly intuitive to me. I'm a little reluctant to ascribe to literature goals that I don't think it can necessarily live up to. Early in my life in California, we had a state superintendent of education who believed that English literature was the best way of teaching morals to our students. And I wanted to scream at him and tell him, if that were true, every English professor I know would be a consummately moral man or woman. And they're not. But I'd be scared I would be forced to give particular proof of that claim, and that would get me in serious trouble. Are our English professors who read so much, are they that empathetic? Maybe. I hope so, but I'm not going to tell you about my colleagues right now, by the way.
Maureen, you're up next. Maureen? Is it Maureen Crowley? Can you unmute? Well, we'll come back to Maureen. Heidi had another question. Okay, Maureen, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was unmuted. I didn't really have a question. I was just thinking about the letter writing and the fact that in Jane's letters back and forth to Cassandra, she mentioned sometimes how clever and smart and what a great writer Cassandra was. And the only evidence really we have of much of Cassandra's writing that I'm aware of, I'm not well schooled in that, is the letter she wrote on Jane's death, which is one of the most moving I've read. So I'm often struck by what I don't know, not what others, what I don't know about Cassandra, because she must herself have been quite an amazing writer.
Well,
Just an observation. That's just an observation.
Sure. Well, in any event, these are astonishingly bright and accomplished girls. You know, I occasionally get angry at Cassandra because Cassandra obviously destroyed all of those letters of Jane Austen's, and I assume her own letters. And that's exactly what we want nowadays. We want to see those letters. But so many of them are gone. The other observation about Jane Austen's love letters is they can be so nasty, so snarky. I mean, and you know, we love to entertain this idea of sweet Jane Austen. Pardon the expression, but bullshit. I mean, she would call it as she saw it, and maybe that's one of the reasons she's such a good novelist. I don't know, but she certainly saw the idiocy that was going on around her and was not shy about sharing it with family members.
Thank you.
Heidi? I think you had a couple of questions, Heidi.
Here I am. I'll make this short. I'm running low on battery and I'm on a boat.
Whoa.
In Puget Sound. So hello, Southern California. So Maureen had made a comment earlier about whether the students, the presence of Mr. Austen's, her father's students in the house may have added to some of the hilarity and silliness, or certainly expanded her family audience of her Juvenalia. But I also wondered, on top of that, about James Austen's influence on his little sister with his publication of the satirical The Loiterer while he was at Oxford, because I believe some folks have contended that in some of those letters to the editor that are found in The Loiterer that are very funny, some of them people have guessed that Jane wrote some of those.
Yep. Well, I mean, I think sometimes the genes will tell. Yeah. And I mean, this is a truly accomplished family in many ways. I mean, we've got the one brother that we know virtually nothing about because he was deficient. But we've got the three brothers who rose, I think, astronomically in the Navy to become admirals. So no, I mean, I think it's a talented family, and they probably sort of cross-fertilized on each other in terms of that intellect and the kinds of ideas that they were playing with. Jane Austen was lucky in that regard, and maybe we're lucky that Jane Austen didn't get married. No, seriously. I mean, think about it for a minute. I mean, we tend to think poor Jane Austen, though. I look at the kinds of marriages she depicts, and occasionally I think she recognizes that marriage is scarcely the guarantee for happiness that the romance novelists that she has read like to imply.
Thank you.
Mary Ashley.
Hi there. I didn't have any questions. I just made a bunch of comments, and I love what you said about Jane potentially being called a nasty woman. And I totally agree, and she would have loved it, and she would have been asked to dedicate her next work to the king. But yeah, thank you for the talk. This is incredible.
And in many ways, the person whose name we're not mentioning is astonishingly like the Prince Regent.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I so love about Jane Austen is she found a way of insulting him to his face without his seeming to understand the insult that she gave him with her dedication. So no, I'm in love with Jane Austen.
Yeah, and that would be so much easy to do today too.
Oh, in some ways, even easier. I mean,
goes right over his head.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, but I have no desire to politicize our group, guys.
One of the questions or comments she made in the chat section, which you didn't see, Lynn, is what would Jane have done in her time if the king had tried to do away with the royal mail system?
We're talking about epistolary letters and how important the communication was, and it's so fascinating what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and I hope you all are aware that for the most part, unless you had a frank yourself, and this was granted to those who were titled, what you had to do is you had to pay to receive. We pay to send the letter, but in Jane Austen's time, you had to pay to receive the letter, sort of an analog to my getting called on my cell phone and having to pay for that phone call when I don't want to receive it.
Jeannie, you had another question earlier about comparing Jane Austen's Juvenalia with other authors' Juvenalia. And she was asking if you found anything similar, either before or after.
As I unfortunately sometimes say to my wife, you obviously think I'm smarter than I am. I don't know. That is not, unfortunately, something that I have pursued. So I don't know enough to answer that.
Okay, I did have another, just a comment though, since we've delved so much into the epistolary form, and it was great to hear everybody's comments and questions about that. Really, we should have a whole topic just on that. But I've been reading a lot of the Juvenalia recently, and I would highly recommend to everyone this wonderful example of a hilarious parody of the epistolary form in volume the first, and it is called Amelia Webster. It's a very short 2 pages, and the letters are like, this long. They're like 1 or 2 sentences each, and they just go boom, 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 rapid fire amongst these 6 characters, I think. And so Amelia Webster, very fast read, but she's obviously making great fun of that epistolary style.
Perfect. And I can find this just by Googling Amelia Webster?
Well, it's in volume the first if you've got it, and otherwise I'm sure you can find it. Yeah,
sure.
On,
okay.
All the Juvenalia is online.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Yes, I understand.
Amelia Webster, volume the first. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's hilarious, you guys. You should really have a lot of fun with that.
Thank you. Other observations?
Another person, I think Sharon, commented that looking at some of the later novels that, like, for example, Caroline Bingley, what she writes to Jane, what she leaves out is even more important than what she actually writes. Do you have any other thoughts on that, like examples of that?
Well, I just think Jane Austen understands perfectly the dynamics of letter writing at her time. And we see that reflected not merely in the little bit of epistolary novel that she wrote, but in the random, in her own letters. I hope you guys, I mean, it is as confusing to read all of Jane Austen's novels, all of Jane Austen's Juvenalia, as it is to try to read all of her letters. But I think they're well worth that effort. And I encourage you to do it. I mean, you get a real sense of what kind of person she is in those letters. And I like it.
Katie, did you have a question?
I do, and in my mom's book, we have the notes from 2006 when we last talked about the Juvenalia, so it's kind of fun to see how long it's been since we talked about it.
Wow.
But just a question about the history of England. When she's talking about the earlier kings and queens, she says by name, but then when we get to James the First, then she starts saying His Majesty. Do you have any idea why she didn't start saying His Majesty until James the First? Because she does it in Charles the First as well, but she doesn't do it prior to that.
I really don't know. I mean, I cannot fit that into what she at least pretends to as favoring the Stuarts, since of course James is not a Stuart. So I actually, James is a Stuart. I don't know.
Okay. Maureen has another question. This is an interesting one about Mrs. Austen. Maureen, you want to go ahead? Let's see if she's, Maureen? She might have left us. Let me ask you the question. Okay. She said, Lynn, you mentioned rather quickly in passing that Mrs. Austen would have been offended if she'd seen an illustrated image of herself that was unflattering. She tries to see Mrs. Austen in all of Austen's work about the mothers, but she's wondering if you could say a little bit more about your take on Mrs. Austen. She wrote funny lyric material for her students.
I don't know. I think Mrs. Austen is a problematic character. I don't know how well this is going to work, but I'm going to try to hold up the picture of her. And she looks like a witch.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, and I'm not totally convinced with the identifications that you can find in our contemporary scholarship now. But I mean, the story we always find ourselves repeating is that Jane Austen is dying, and Mrs. Austen demands the best chair and the most comfortable spot, which suggests that she thinks more of herself than the people around her. So Mrs. Austen has gotten, perhaps deservedly, perhaps not deservedly, some pretty bad press from us who are reading and trying to think about Jane Austen. But I don't know. I happen to be, just as I am doubtful of many of the things that Austen Lee says about his aunt, I'm doubtful of many of the things that we supposedly have learned about other folks in Jane Austen's family.
Okay, we're starting to, I don't think we have too many more questions. I mean, we don't have any more questions. So if anybody has any, please chat them right now or raise your hand. I have one question. Do you have a favorite piece of the Juvenalia? Do you have a favorite among all the Juvenalia?
You know, I and maybe this is why I chose to talk about it, but I think I'm going to vote for Leslie Castle. It turns me on to the extent that I think I see in it where Jane Austen ultimately is going to go, how she's going to grow up and perfect perfect her skills. So that's the one I'd vote for. Other people, I'd be interested in hearing other people's favorites, and ideally not any of the works that I had tried to talk about here.
Yes, The Three Sisters is
Yeah.
great fun, hilarious, great satire and parody and pitting at least two sisters against one sister. A very interesting mother, a boorish suitor. Great fun.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Others?
Go ahead, Laura.
I have a question. I have two questions. How did you pick those particular pieces out of all of them?
Well, the first part of my answer was I initially tried to encompass lots more of them, and it became unwieldy. So then what I tried to do is to pick works that I thought were representative in terms of stages in her novelistic development. But I've read them all. I would love to believe that I could stand an examination of the individual characters in each of the pieces, and I am certain that if I did take that exam, I would come up with a failing mark, because in my mind, so many of them, indeed, so many within an individual work run together, and then when I get all of them together, I find myself confused. So I worked backwards from looking at what I thought I saw Jane Austen headed in the direction, and then picked representative works that I thought helped support my theory. But that's a bad principle, guys.
Well,
I start with the answer and pick the bits of data that will support what I've already decided is true. And
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because I was getting confused, but likewise, once with all the characters. But I had another question. I know about Catherine and the Bower.
yes,
That's pure silliness.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
And then there's a completion that's just come out. Have you read that one yet?
No.
Has anyone else read it? I'm curious about people's reaction to it. I had to stop reading it because I was getting so confused. I mean, I was even confused during the part that Jane Austen wrote.
Yeah.
But I wondered if anyone else had that problem.
I haven't read it. And do keep in mind that the movie Love and Friendship is not what you and I think it is. I mean, they have stolen the title of Love and Friendship, but it's really Lady Susan. And I'd like to beat senseless the makers of that film for creating that confusion.
I would like to say something.
Yes.
I'm Betty Parker Ellis, and I bring you greetings from the East Coast. I'm sitting here in Greenville, South Carolina.
Splendid.
With the beautiful communication through the internet and liking all the chapters I can get my hands on across our JASNA world. I ended up in your Zoom meeting tonight, and I just wanted to say, Lynn, what a lovely, lovely presentation that you provided us. And the chat box, at least on my computer, isn't allowing me to say anything, so I thought I ought to just do it personally instead of writing it in the chat box. But I just want to say what a thrill it is to be a part of your meeting tonight and to listen to this wonderful discussion about the Juvenilia. That's the one area that I haven't really learned that much about. And so I feel with October around the corner, I feel a deficit. So this is allowed me to feel like I'm getting a little bit more of an education on the subject so that I can get a little farther along before October arrives. But anyway, just wanted to say hello and give you my compliments and make my introduction. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and I will extend to you my Virginian hospitality. So thank you, thank you.
We have a couple more hands up, and we have another question, and we have a lot of comments, which I'll share with you later, Lynn, from everyone in the chat box about how much they've enjoyed this. Marcia Hamley has a question. Marcia, are you still there?
Yes, sorry. I was wondering.
Oh, we just lost you, Marcia.
Dear.
There you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I wrote a question in the chat box. I was wondering about Catherine of the Bower, which was the last story in her volume 3, and whether you thought it also pointed toward her more mature writings.
My answer is yes, and I think there's some real sophisticated dimensions to Catherine of the Bower, and I probably should have dropped that into the mix that we talked about. But for those of you who don't know it, you really should take a look at it. I think it's an important book, or important part of Jane Austen. Thank you.
And a few people in the chat box were talking about The Beautiful Cassandra also as a favorite.
Yep. Yes.
So Linda Feynman, I think, has her hand. Yeah, Linda, are you still there?
Yes, thanks for calling on me again. And Lynn, thank you so much for bringing so much joy to this subject and really just cheering my whole week. I just wanted to get your advice. I think it was Jeannie who mentioned her book club chose a Juvenalia and the meeting kind of fell flat. And I wondered what your advice would be for a book club who meets once a month. And so obviously we don't want to read all of the Juvenalia probably in 4 weeks. Would you just give us maybe a recipe for what we might accomplish like in a 1 month time period, and then be ready to discuss? Would it be the works that you chose to highlight when you gave your talk? Or
obviously the easiest answer is say, why don't you do what I did?
That's what I'm thinking.
I have no pride of authorship here. Indeed, if you'd like for me to send you what I wrote out and talked about, I'm pleased to do that. Just let me know.
That'd be awesome.
But I mean, I certainly do not believe that that is necessarily the ideal way of going. I do think the ideal way of going is a bit of savvy picking and choosing. And there are so many favorites in this that you could do exactly the kind of thing that I did without necessarily talking about the 5 works that I talked about. But I don't think you want more than 5 works for a book group in order to try to balance, simply because I mean, look, I stand in front of the refrigerator, and by the time I get to the 4th thing that I need to get from the store, I need a piece of paper. So I do think 4 and 5 sort of are the limit that our minds can handle here.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, Jeannie, what she was saying earlier, I think, was I attended their event in June, and because they will kind of fall flat unless you read them, they had readings with people. They would have a little placard with who they were because they changed characters, and I was on the floor laughing too. It was very, very funny. So reading them out loud is a good way for a book group. Jeannie,
I think that's a really smart observation. I mean, one thing is to talk about them, but maybe the best thing, and I certainly am not an actor by any means, but one way of experiencing it would be simply to have people act out, read these. And you know, that might be the real solution to a good book group.
It was very entertaining.
I don't know if y'all know that the Jane Austen summer program in North Carolina does a theatrical every year based on one of the Juvenalia works. But the funny thing is they've got a running gag where there always appears a sock puppet, no matter what. And that has just been hilarious to make sure one of the characters is a sock puppet.
I'm going to try that.
So Leela Dooley has been very patiently waiting. Leela, you're up.
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. Yes.
Okay. It was mostly going back to your favorite of the Juvenilia, and I honestly can't pick a favorite because I think Juvenalia is just fantastically great. I went to an AGM a few years ago, I think the one up in San Francisco, where the main speaker was the guy, why am I forgetting his name? He wrote The Deal, Not Mysteries, one of which is, but anyway, he talked about reading it as a kid and how it reminded him of the Goonies. You know, that he, you know, as a child, when he read it, he was like, oh my God, it's the Goonies, written so long ago. And I remember that, but I'm putting in a plug for the beautiful Cassandra. I have a wonderful edition that was published by Juliet McMaster's Juvenalia Press, where she did the illustrations, and it's so charming. It's the most wonderful little book I have. It's one of my favorite books in my collection. But also, the Juvenalia contains two of my absolute all-time favorite Jane Austen lines. The first one is from Love and Friendship. It's a piece of advice I've lived on my entire life. Run mad as often as you choose, but do not faint. Fainting is bad. You'll die if you faint. So I tried to remember that my entire life. And then also Lady Susan, who describes, I think it's Mr. Johnson, I don't have the book right now in front of me, her best, you know, her friend's husband, as just being at that terrible age, too old to be amusing and too young to die. I think that is one of the best lines. And I think what I like about the Juvenalia is maybe she wasn't trying to be polite. She was just letting it all out there. And the closest I ever came, and I speak as a retired librarian, the closest I ever came to stealing a library book was at my library in my hometown, and they had a copy of volume the first. I checked it out and so didn't want to return that book. Oh my God. I wanted to keep that book so bad. I kept trying to justify, like, really, is anybody else ever going to want to read this book? Probably, but then I was good. And I read it. I returned it. Whew. As a librarian, I feel terrible to this day. But I found it a couple of years later. I was on a trip to England, and I found a copy of it there, and I brought it home, and so, yay. So anyway, and then just to iterate with everybody else how much I have enjoyed this discussion about the Juvenalia. This stuff is great. It's the best stuff, almost ever. So,
thank you for saying that. And by the way, the real virtue of the conversation was everyone contributing. So yeah, this has been a great group of people to work with.
Thank you.
And by the way, if you look at some of the academic criticism of the Juvenalia, you'll see some what I think are absolutely wrong-headed approaches to the Juvenalia. I mean, I read someone who wanted to compare what Jane Austen was doing in the Juvenalia to what Samuel Beckett was doing with the Theatre of the Absurd. And I wanted to take that book and throw it across the room. No, this is not Samuel Beckett here. She knows exactly what she's doing, and that just is an attempt to make her into something I think she's emphatically not. So don't pay attention to some of my colleagues and what they have done to what they have done. Am I still there?
You're still here.
Good. Okay. Let me see what happens.
We have a question from Ann Cassidy.
Okay. Let me see what happens. There we go. Good. Okay.
Okay, so we're good? Okay. Ann Cassidy, do you have a question? she wrote in the chat, would you consider Lady Susan a more modern version of the epistolary novel? And she mentions Richardson and Burney write letters as a literary convention. Their length and detail have a high degree of artificiality, where the letters in Lady Susan resemble actual contemporary letters.
Yeah, I think I would. I think I would. That strikes me as a nice observation. I cannot claim to have followed the trajectory of all epistolary novels, but obviously Jane Austen is writing Lady Susan after folks like Richardson and Fanny Burney are writing them. So no, I think so.
Great. Anybody else have any questions? We're out of questions, I think, unless someone has a burning one they haven't asked.
Hi, I'd like to say hello. I was part of this group 20 years ago before we relocated to the Bay Area. So I really appreciate the opportunity from Susie and also Clara and Katie and Claire and Lynn to put this on. And I agree with you about Buster Keaton. Sherlock Jr. is a really good.
Yes.
I also really feel I've learned a lot about both the Juvenalia and the epistolary form today, and it's been delightful. But speaking to your comments about Leslie Castle, I noticed in the letters exchanged between Eloisa Luttrell and Mrs. Marlowe, a kind of Sense and Sensibility feeling. And Eloisa wants to dwell on the death of Henry Harvey, her fiancé. And Mrs. Marlowe writes her, I think the melancholy indulgence of your own sorrows by repeating them and dwelling on them to me will only encourage and increase them, and that it will be more prudent in you to avoid so sad a subject. So I felt that there were maybe early forms of Marianne and Eleanor in those characters.
Absolutely. I mean, this is where Marianne's sensibility comes from. No, I agree 100%.
Jerry?
Susie, may I comment that I had cheated and read Lady Susan shortly before starting to read the Juvenalia.
You shouldn't have.
And I shouldn't have, but it has become one of my favorite novels. I think the level of sophistication in that correspondence and that form was extremely effective.
It's a leap forward. Yep. Yep.
Some of the most sophisticated characters she ever created are in that.
And then my argument is she finds herself reborn in Mary Crawford. And maybe Mary Crawford wouldn't be as great a character were it not for the fact that she came from Lady Susan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Diane Allison has her hand up. Diane, go ahead.
I've been really enjoying this. What has suddenly struck me is that if Jane Austen had been alive today, maybe she would have become a stand-up comedian. She has so much wit and satire, and she sees life with observed. I mean, her Juvenile is so observed. She's a child, and she's writing a lot of observation about human nature.
You know, my first response to what you said was, oh, I don't think so. The more I think about it, and I think about the comedians that one on occasion sees on television, I'm now sort of getting myself seduced into agreeing with you. I mean, there's a wonderfully wicked wit in terms of her social commentary. And that's what some of the most successful of our comedians, find themselves doing nowadays. I like that. I can see booking her in Vegas. and honestly, I can, many years ago, I was when I was a kid, I went to Second City in Chicago, And my thought there, and it was wonderful, but my thought there was it cost so much to go to Second City that most of the people in the audience were so wealthy that they didn't understand the social commentary that they were supposed to be laughing at. I mean, I went there and ate cheese sandwiches for a couple of weeks in order to pay for my ticket. But I think I got all of the jokes. The wealthy people sitting in front of me with the diamond rings on the hands and the fur stoles, I don't think they got what was going on at all. So I like that observation.
Marcia Hamley has another question. Marcia, go ahead.
So, one thing I forgot to ask, so this is like a whole nother can of worms, but I'm going for it. What do you think about Jane Austen as a proto-feminist? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Many of the young women in the Juvenalia are so free and unbothered by societal expectations.
Yep.
And some scholars, etc., have said that she had to tone down her proto-feminism in order to realistically be able to sell her novels. But I've also heard it argued that her novels are more mature writing, that she's not just toning it down. And I just sort of love to hear you weigh in on that area.
I think I have a major problem when I like any author, because the fact that I like that author, I want that author to agree with me in political and social and religious terms. I think that's a dangerous direction to go in, by the way. I love Jane Austen. As I alluded to in my written out comments, I do think Austen Lee is right when he characterizes Jane Austen as a moderate Tory, as a moderate conservative. My reading of Jane Austen is she is the exact opposite of the on strike, shut it down feminist. I think she is, I think she, well, really what I think Jane Austen thinks things are bad, guys. But I think Jane Austen's solution is not so much changing the system, which I don't think she believes can easily be changed. I think her solution is learn how to work the system. And I happen to believe that that is the best solution that's the realistic solution for the feminist. So, I mean, I see her as being the exact opposite of a Mary Shelley, for example. I think I think she believes that I think she believes that there are problems women face, and she is absolutely aware of them. But I think the solution is education more than getting rid of, say, for example, the electoral college. The electoral college. You're just pretending there's an easy solution out there when it isn't there. But I'm sorry, I've just told you more about me than about Jane Austen, and don't believe anything that I said about Jane Austen. Do believe what I said about me, however.
Thank you.
Jan has her hand up. Jan? Jan, do you want to unmute?
Sorry. Hi. When I first read Lady Susan, it reminded me a lot of Les Liaisons Dangereuses by Laclos,
yeah,
which was written during her early years. I don't know, do you know if it was even available to her in translation at that time, or whether she might have read it?
I don't know, but I agree with you. I mean, it's the treatment of the problem of the rake. No, but
Well,
My
and it's
answer
an
is,
epistolary novel
yep,
about
yep,
seduction.
yep, yes, yep.
So I just wondered if you knew whether she might have had access to it.
Again, you have run up against my ignorance here.
We're having a few comments about some of the characters, like Lizzie being so strong, you know, that Jane Austen might not have wanted to get rid of the Electoral College, but she certainly wrote a lot of really strong women who would stand up for themselves in a patriarchy as best they could in that society.
I agree. I agree.
Okay, so anybody else? I'm not seeing any other. We addressed everybody's questions. We, well, oh, we have another. JC, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question about people, what your thoughts are about people taking a work like Sanditon and trying to finish it. And in my opinion, the production of it on television was so un-Jane-like that it might have done a disservice to her work versus being a positive.
You know, I mean, I think what we're seeing in and there are many, we've got the movie completions, we've got the written completions of Sanditon. I think it's simply a manifestation of what I mentioned, and that is we want more. It is not fair that Jane Austen died, and Sanditon, I mean, the fascinating thing to me about Sanditon is I'm not totally certain where it was going to go. So our interpretations go off in other directions. My real answer is don't do that to Jane Austen unless it leads people to start reading Jane Austen. So the movie versions, some are more faithful than others. I can get on occasion really angry at, but then I think there's this 17-year-old out there who has watched the movie, has watched the thing that I think is so wrong, but somehow it's inspired that person to go out and actually read Jane Austen. And anything that causes people to read Jane Austen is something that I've got to stand behind emphatically. So I'm giving you a totally ambiguous answer. The bad treatment of Jane Austen in some ways strikes me as being potentially better than no treatment of Jane Austen at all.
Thank you. Okay.
Lynn, do you want to
Yes.
ask your question? The other Lynn, sorry, there's another Lynn from Sacramento.
Oh, my question is that first of all, I'm so proud you're a professor and that you've been teaching Jane Austen, and our group has been wanting to promote Jane Austen in the curriculum. So my question was, obviously you're doing it and you've made a big impact. So just ideas how we can try to get Jane Austen into like all levels of our school curriculum.
I have no idea how to influence school curricula. I'm sorry. You know, it's my teaching of Jane Austen was more an act of personal love on my part. Before I taught Jane Austen, all the English department had was a sort of generic title called Studies in an Individual Author. You know, studies in a single author, which we like to joke about. Does this mean the author cannot be married? So I taught Jane Austen because I wanted, and the department needed people to teach what was then the English 110 course. I satisfied a department requirement, and at the same time was able to, I hope, to seduce a number of students into liking her. I will share with you what I think my greatest challenge in trying to teach Jane Austen was, and it was irony. It's one thing. I mean, I had students who read It Is the Truth Universally, and they believed that Jane Austen really believed that that was a truth universally acknowledged. And in some ways, telling someone that a statement is ironic and they should not take it at face value is one of the toughest things in the world. So I often ended a quarter assuming that a certain percentage of my students throughout 10 weeks still had not actually heard any of Jane Austen's irony. And I don't have an answer for that. In part, it's good to try, and my hope is if they didn't get Jane Austen's irony during my class, at least maybe they would get some irony next quarter.
Well, sometimes it's good they're making movies about it.
Yes.
Get them interested. But I also wanted to, on that point, that I'm really not sure right now, but Jane Austen's books weren't on required reading. They were on recommended reading, but not required in high school English and so forth. So I always thought that was something that should change, that Jane Austen should be required reading. But,
you know, I love Jane Austen. And I have no idea what high schools are doing nowadays, but I can tell you that when I went to high school, Pride and Prejudice was required of at least my 10th grade English class.
Oh, really?
And I'm not certain it's a good idea to make 10th grade boys read Jane Austen. And I'm sorry, what we really need to do is to match the literary work with the cognitive level, the social level of the people we're asking to read. In many ways, it was like in 9th grade, I had to read Idylls of the King. And whoever came up with that idea should have been beaten senseless. I do think Pride and Prejudice is a bit, makes a bit more sense than Idylls of the King did. But I don't have an easy answer there. I want people to read Jane Austen, but I don't want them to hate Jane Austen. And I fear that some curricula out there force upon students literary works that they are not prepared for at that stage.
Well, another question I had was just things that I've heard is that Jane Austen is becoming a bigger tourist attraction in England than Shakespeare.
That's fascinating.
You know, that she's really making advances there. So.
Whoa, well, I mean, she is on the 10-pound note.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I find fascinating. I mean, I think Jane Austen despised Bath and all it stood for. And the last time I was in Bath, they were selling Bath using Jane Austen. I can see her coming back from the dead and cursing the city of Bath for what it was doing. Of course, all things Jane Austen I enjoy, so I had no problem with it, but I think she might have.
Well, thank you for your comments. And I graduated high school in 1961 also.
Whoa, okay, all righty.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a couple more hands up. Cara King, go ahead.
Yeah, Lynn, I was struck when you were talking about young people sometimes missing the irony. I first read Pride and Prejudice when I was 13 by my choice, my dad's suggestion. I loved it. But I will say there were a couple moments, like when Elizabeth says, Jane asks something like, when was the first time you started having feelings for Darcy? And Elizabeth says, when I saw his estate at Pemberley. And I was shocked and so disappointed because I had thought Elizabeth was better than that.
I love it. I love it.
And then at the end, when I forget who, but Mr. Bennet's, who asked him that, Mr. Bennett says who his favorite son-in-laws are, and he says, Wickham's the top. I was like, oh no, I thought he had seen through Wickham. I am shocked. But I will say that by college, I got the jokes in those.
Right. And look, we've got to start somewhere. And my fear of making a 9th grade boy reading Pride and Prejudice has got to be balanced against the fact that you got to start reading somewhere. And books that I read when I was 14, curiously have changed radically. I don't know how the pages in the book changed, but the book is no longer the book that I read when I was in my teens. It's a different book, but this is one of those truths of life. We see in novels what we bring to those novels. And my problem was I didn't bring to that novel that much when I was 14.
Well, thank you.
So
Thank
Linda
you.
has her hand. Linda, go ahead.
Yes, Lynn, just following up on your experiences as a professor, I had a chat with a professor at a recent conference, and she's been teaching Austen for decades. And one thing she reported is now she has wait lists for her class because Jane Austen is more popular than ever. But she said before the movie adaptations, and in particular the Colin Firth series, she always had like an equal number of male and female students, that her classes were very well balanced. But after those adaptations, it's like almost universally female. That's all that takes her courses now.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, I've been retired for over 10 years now, so I don't know, but I'm going to quote you. That is so very interesting.
She said something, I hope this doesn't sound politically incorrect. What she actually said was, I used to have an equal number of boys and girls in my courses. Now I have all women and a few gay men, is what she told me.
Fascinating. Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
Gendered. Oh, this is, I've got to really think about that.
Yeah.
I have no idea what's going on at UCLA now. Well, of course, nothing's going on at UCLA now. I don't know. Wow. Yeah, that was an eye-opener. Thank you.
Yeah, for me too.
So anybody else? I don't see anybody else's hand up. Katie, Emily, anybody in the queue? I don't see anybody in the queue. Nope. All right. Last chance, everybody. So Lynn, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you, as always.
Thank you. And look, I mean, you have collected some extraordinarily bright and engaged people. And this was fun. I would have done it for free. So it's a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your coming. You guys know how to do the reactions? Like, you want us to give a little.
Oh.
Okay. Great.
I don't know
Thank
how
you,
to do that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So everybody, we're recording this and we will post it, and we'll share it. Lynn's going to share his intro, and we'll share that. Okay. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks, Lynn.
Be safe.
Take care. Great.
Don't leave. I want to ask Susie.
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thanks,
Laura.
Kate.
Good to see you. Yes, thanks, Katie and Emily, for co-hosting. It was wonderful. Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, Susie from Sacramento, California.
Thank you for joining us.
So allowing us to join you. It's so much fun.
It's great to have everyone.
You're on.
Somebody asked in the chat, will you be sending the link out, the recording of the link to the recording?
Yes. Okay, we'll see you guys in September. September 26th. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Susie,
Yes, Laura.
what are we going to do for 2 months from now for our book club?
That's a good question. I'm sure Katie will be talking with Clara, and we will send that out. So
I will email Clara and Lynn as soon as we're done and ask what we'll be reading for the next book.
We could finish the Juvenalia.
I will suggest that to them.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Okay.